Komi, a tall, slim young man in his late 20s from Nigeria, walked confidently along the dusty red street, his cheap but colorful shirt pressed neatly, his shoes polished to a shine, his face carrying a proud smirk as if the whole world existed to admire him. Children played in the distance, traders shouted in the market stalls, and yet all attention seemed drawn to his posture, his arrogance, and the aura of charm he believed was unshakable. Inside his modest Nigerian bedroom, Sukomi prepared for the night like a king about to face his court. He stood before a cracked mirror, adjusting a bright, flashy shirt, combing his hair with delicate pride, and spraying cheap perfume until the air was thick, while scattered clothes lay across the small wooden bed. A weak bulb glowing above him, walls covered with torn posters, and every detail reflecting his desperate hunger to shine brighter than he truly was. The night buzzed with noise inside Mama Cootie's beer parlor, where yellow bulbs cast a dim glow on wooden benches crowded with men drinking local beer. Smoke rising in the humid air, and Mama Cootie herself, wrapped in a bright Ankara cloth, stood behind the counter with authority, while Sukomi entered boldly in his flashy clothes, his smile wide, his presence magnetic, drawing admiring glances and cheers from friends who welcomed him like a star among ordinary souls. Sukomi leaned back on the rough wooden bench inside Mama Cootie's noisy parlor, his arms stretched wide as if to claim the entire room, his voice booming over the chatter and clinking bottles, telling tales of his latest conquests with women, each story more exaggerated than the last, his friends laughing loudly, some slapping the table, others shaking their heads in disbelief yet secretly admiring his boldness, while he puffed out his chest with pride, raising his glass high, convinced that he was untouchable, the master of charm and desire, the man every woman secretly longed for. And as the smoky air grew thicker with laughter, his words danced like sparks, igniting envy in some, fascination in others, but all feeding the fire of his ego, making him feel larger than life, unaware that beneath the glow of his own confidence, shadows of fate were slowly gathering, waiting to remind him that pride never walks alone for long. Sukomi's charm found its latest target in a young nursing student, a bright-eyed woman with ambition written in every gesture, her crisp uniform marking her as disciplined and focused, yet she melted under the weight of his practiced words, the sly compliments whispered in crowded streets, the promises of affection spun like golden threads, until she, too, became another name on his list of victories, another conquest to brag about among his peers. They met in secret corners of the town, where he flattered her dreams, convincing her that she was unlike the rest, while in truth he saw her only as a new trophy to polish his pride, a fleeting prize to feed his hunger for validation. And as she blushed at his attention, imagining love where there was only selfishness, Sukomi basked in the glow of his own deception, never pausing to consider the heart he toyed with, never thinking that her trust was a fragile gift he would soon crush carelessly. Sukomi's restless desires soon carried him into the path of a church choir mistress, a graceful woman whose voice soared each Sunday like a hymn to heaven, her flowing dresses modest yet elegant, her heart soft with faith, and still she was not immune to the honeyed trap of his charm. He waited outside rehearsals with that disarming smile, offering rides, compliments, and whispers of admiration, until her guard slowly slipped, and their meetings stretched beyond church walls into dimly lit cafes and quiet corners, where she wrestled with guilt while he basked in triumph, feeding his vanity on the irony of seducing one entrusted with songs of devotion, boasting silently to himself that no woman, sacred or worldly, could resist his pull, and in her trembling eyes, torn between loyalty to God and surrender to desire, lay the tragic proof of his power, a power he wielded recklessly without thought of the wounds it left behind. Sukomi's recklessness reached new depths when he entangled himself with a married woman, a striking figure draped often in elegant wrappers, her fingers bearing the glitter of wedding rings that told a story he chose to ignore. Drawn to her confidence and the thrill of forbidden fruit, he pursued her with sly words and lingering touches until secrecy blossomed into dangerous intimacy, their meetings cloaked in shadows behind closed doors, stolen moments of laughter and reckless passion where she tried to silence her conscience and he gloried in the victory of taking what belonged to another. The whispers of neighbors grew louder with each passing day, yet Sukomi relished the risk, mistaking danger for proof of his irresistible charm. never pausing to see that every stolen embrace was a blade carving cracks into a fragile home. And while her heart quivered between guilt and desire, he strutted proudly, blind to the storm he was planting with his careless pride. One humid evening, Sukomi sat with Babs, his oldest friend, under the flickering bulb outside Mama Cootie's parlor, bottles of cheap beer between them. When Babs leaned closer, his tone heavy with concern rather than laughter, warning him that his endless pursuits were like sparks dancing too close to dry grass. Babs spoke of enemies, jealous husbands, envious rivals, and spirits angered by careless living, urging Sukomi to slow down before his charm became his curse. But Sukomi only laughed, brushing the words aside as though they were nothing more than smoke in the night, his pride deafening him to the wisdom in his friend's trembling voice. And while Babs shook his head, uneasy at the arrogance before him, the sounds of music and drunken chatter filled the street, drowning out the weight of the warning, leaving Sukomi to believe he was untouchable, never realizing that fate often whispers its cautions before striking its loudest blow. Among the many women who drifted into Sukomi's orbit, none were more dangerous than Amara and Runo, two striking beauties whose rivalry was whispered about across the dusty streets, their sharp eyes and fiery tempers making them both irresistible and terrifying. Amara, with skin that glowed like polished bronze and laughter that could melt resolve, carried herself with the pride of a queen, while Runo, tall and fierce, with bracelets jingling on her wrists, moved like a storm that refused to be tamed. And though each woman knew of the other, Sukomi believed his wit and swagger could balance their passions, juggling promises, stolen meetings, and whispered lies in dark corners, blind to the tension building like thunderclouds above him. The town watched with hushed anticipation, knowing fire cannot embrace fire without sparks. And while Sukomi boasted of his conquests, the two women plotted silently, their hearts ablaze with emotions far stronger than the careless man who thought himself in control. Sukomi's pride was tested when whispers reached him about a young university student known mockingly as Holy Holy, a woman admired for her virtue, discipline, and unshakable faith, who carried herself with quiet dignity, rejecting the advances of countless men. The challenge intrigued him, for nothing delighted Sukomi more than conquering what seemed impossible, so he sharpened his words, polished his smile, and approached her with relentless charm, showering her with compliments, gifts, and promises of undying affection. Yet each attempt was met with calm refusal and eyes that saw through the glitter of his lies, her composure striking deeper than insults, making Sukomi restless with wounded ego. While his friends laughed at his failure, he grew obsessed, determined to bend her spirit, not out of love but to protect his reputation, never realizing that her resistance was a mirror reflecting his emptiness, a quiet storm reminding him that not every heart could be deceived or broken. When the gossip of his endless affairs began to echo louder through the village streets, whispered by traders at the market and murmured by elders at evening gatherings, Sukomi did not shrink or hide, but instead accepted the reputation with pride, wearing it like a crown he believed he had earned. Each time someone hinted at his reckless ways, he laughed boldly, slapping his chest and declaring himself the unrivaled conqueror of hearts, a man too charming to be confined by one woman's love. And, while mothers shook their heads in pity and fathers warned their sons against such vanity, Sukomi basked in the attention, mistaking notoriety for glory, his stride longer, his grin sharper, his voice louder in every beer parlor, as if the disapproval of the wise was nothing compared to the admiration of his foolish peers. In that arrogance, he believed his story was one of triumph, never realizing he was only weaving the threads of his own downfall. In the heart of the bustling village, where laughter and gossip mixed with the aroma of roasted plantain and the hum of evening markets, there emerged a figure whose presence was as unsettling as it was magnetic. Fair, a man draped in flowing garments of deep indigo, his tall frame carrying the quiet authority of someone both feared and respected. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to pierce through the chatter of the crowd, reading thoughts before they were spoken. And though he smiled, rarely, when he did, it was the kind of smile that concealed more than it revealed. Fair was no ordinary villager but a man whose wealth, cunning, and influence reached beyond the narrow paths of the community, whispered about by traders who claimed he dealt with powers unseen, and by rivals who dared not cross him. Wherever he went, silence followed, for his name alone carried weight, and while Sukomi boasted in taverns, Fair listened in shadows, already charting the lines of a story that would soon entangle both their fates. The night of the grand village party glimmered with lanterns swinging in the breeze, drums echoing through the air, and laughter spilling into the streets, when Sukomi arrived dressed in his finest agbada, golden embroidery shining under the moonlight, his swagger impossible to ignore as he moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man certain all eyes belonged to him. Music throbbed, dancers twirled, and vendors shouted, yet amidst the celebration, unseen eyes tracked his every move, for Fair had chosen this very night to make his presence known, lurking at the edges with a calm smile, watching Sukomi boast, flirt, and drink with reckless abandon. Then as the drums thundered into a furious rhythm, the chase began, not with feet but with gazes, tension coiling between predator and prey, Sukomi still oblivious, basking in fleeting glory, while Fair's patience unfolded like a net, tightening slowly, ensuring that the dance of pursuit had already begun long before Sukomi realized he was being hunted. Despite their different worlds, the bond between Sukomi and Fair began to grow in strange, unspoken ways, starting with brief conversations at village gatherings, then stretching into long nights of talk where secrets slipped like wine into the air, each man testing the other with words laced in charm and caution. Sukomi, drawn to Fair's wealth and quiet authority, found himself flattered by the attention, while Fair, ever the strategist, studied Sukomi's pride and weaknesses with the patience of a hunter watching prey circle near the trap. Laughter mixed with riddles, handshakes grew firmer, and glances hinted at trust. Yet beneath the surface, the foundation was unstable, built on Sukomi's hunger for validation and Fair's silent schemes. And so what appeared to be friendship blossoming under the moonlight was, in truth, a dangerous relationship taking root, its branches stretching outward with the promise of shade, yet its roots already digging into soil poisoned by deceit. It began subtly, almost too quietly for Sukomi to notice, with nights of restless tossing where his once boastful body now ached in ways he could not explain, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead even when the evening winds were cool, and a cough, light at first, grew into a persistent rattle that unsettled his friends. Yet he dismissed the warnings, laughing it off as fatigue from late nights and endless indulgence, refusing to admit that his strength was fading, for pride would not allow him to look weak. But as days passed, his reflection betrayed him. Eyes losing their fire, cheeks hollowing, footsteps slower, and the vibrant clothes he once wore seemed to hang loosely upon him, shadows clinging to his frame. Whispers began in the marketplace, murmurs that Sukomi, the great charmer, was no longer untouchable, and though he smiled to cover his decline, inside he felt the creeping chill of a sickness that was slowly tightening its grip. The change became impossible to ignore the morning Sukomi staggered into the marketplace, his once bright eyes now tinted with an eerie yellow that caught the attention of every passerby, turning whispers into sharp gasps as women selling peppers paused mid-sale and children shrank back in fear. Traders exchanged uneasy glances, some muttering that it was a curse, others insisting it was the consequence of reckless living, and though Sukomi forced a smile, laughing too loudly to mask his unease, the truth weighed heavy in his chest as even his closest companions avoided meeting his gaze. The charm that once made him the center of attention now marked him with suspicion, a living reminder that something dark was festering within. Yet instead of humility, he clung to arrogance, brushing off concerned voices and daring anyone to challenge him, not realizing that the yellow glow in his eyes had become a silent herald, announcing to the world that his downfall was no longer a distant threat, but a creeping reality. Among those who watched Sukomi's decline with sharper eyes was his cousin, a man who had grown up with him, shared meals under the same roof, and knew his habits better than most. And though the others dismissed the yellowing eyes and frail body as the cost of excessive living, the cousin sensed something deeper, a secret wound festering behind Sukomi's forced laughter. He noticed the way Sukomi avoided sunlight, the trembling hands he tried to hide, the sudden silences that followed coughing, fits, and the hollow ring in his once booming voice, all of which painted a picture that was darker than Sukomi would ever admit. Suspicion gnawed at him, not only of illness but of unseen forces, perhaps even the dangerous ties Sukomi had forged with men like Fair. And while he asked questions softly, Sukomi brushed them aside, leaving the cousin torn between loyalty and fear. knowing that silence might protect Sakomi's pride, but would also quicken his ruin. When the family finally gathered around him, their voices a mixture of fear and love, urging him to seek help, Sakomi brushed them off with the same arrogance that once made him feel untouchable, laughing too loudly as he claimed his body was as strong as ever, that the yellow in his eyes was nothing but tiredness from restless nights, and that his cough was no more than dust from the village streets. His mother's tearful pleas and his cousin's firm warnings bounced against the wall of his pride, for admitting weakness meant admitting defeat, and Sakomi's image as the charmer, the untamed conqueror of hearts, was too precious for him to let slip away. Instead of accepting their concern, he turned defensive, mocking their worries and storming out with a swagger that no longer matched his failing strength, leaving behind a room heavy with silence, as his family exchanged troubled glances, realizing denial was now his deadliest companion. At first, his friends tried to ignore the whispers, brushing aside the unease that crept into their hearts. But as Sakomi's sickness deepened and his once vibrant eyes glowed with that unnatural yellow, laughter that once rang loud in taverns was replaced by uneasy silence whenever he entered. Men who had shared drinks with him now shifted away, their cups suddenly empty, their excuses flowing quicker than the palm wine, and women who once fought for his attention turned their backs, pretending not to see him. Sakomi, still clinging to pride, walked among them with forced swagger, greeting companions who avoided his touch, but each rejection cut deeper than he admitted, the marketplace echoing with the space where his voice once commanded. Children stared from a distance, elders shook their heads, and soon the circle of friendship that had once been his shield crumbled, leaving him standing alone in the very places where he had once been celebrated as a king among men. As Sakomi's condition worsened, the problems began to creep into his work, first as small mistakes that could be laughed off, forgotten with a charming grin, but soon growing into serious failures that could no longer be hidden. He arrived late, his once sharp hands trembling as he struggled with simple tasks, his voice cracking when called upon to deliver responsibilities he had once performed with flair, and colleagues began whispering, trading uneasy glances that carried both pity and judgment. Supervisors who had once praised his energy grew stern, questioning his reliability, while apprentices who once admired him now avoided his shadow, fearful of catching whatever invisible plague seemed to gnaw at him. Sakomi fought to maintain the mask of strength, forcing smiles, blaming fatigue or hunger. Yet the cracks widened each day, until work that had once been his pride became another stage where failure exposed him, stripping away the last fragments of respect he clung to. The breaking point came when Sakomi's boss, a man known for patience yet unable to ignore mounting complaints, summoned him into the office, his tone heavy with both concern and authority, demanding answers for the missed deadlines, careless mistakes, and unsettling rumors that clung to Sakomi like shadows. Sitting across the desk, Sakomi tried to muster his old charm, forcing a smile and offering excuses about sleepless nights and temporary weakness. But the trembling in his hands and the hollowness in his eyes betrayed him more than words ever could. The boss leaned forward, his voice stern, warning that the workplace was no longer a place for reckless pride, that responsibility meant more than image, and that Sakomi risked not only his job but the trust of everyone who once looked up to him. Yet, even in that moment, pride pushed Sakomi to deny the truth, leaving the room with a fragile swagger that fooled no one. The final sting of disgrace came one crowded evening at Mama Cootie's beer parlor, a place where Sakomi had once reigned like a king, striding in with laughter that shook the walls, commanding drinks for friends and admirers who clung to his every word. But now, as he pushed through the door with weakened steps, the atmosphere shifted sharply, conversations halting as eyes turned toward the hollow figure he had become. Whispers spread like fire, mocking his frail frame, the yellow gleam in his eyes, the cough he failed to suppress. And when he tried to order a round as in the old days, Mama Cootie herself hesitated, her lips tightening before she refused with a shake of her head, saying softly but firmly that credit was no longer possible. Laughter erupted from the corner where men once praised him. Women giggled behind their palms, and Sakomi, burning with shame, staggered out into the night, realizing he was no longer the adored charmer, but a fallen shadow of himself. Fair, who had once been the most dangerous and intoxicating presence in Sakomi's life, the woman who pursued him with relentless passion, began to withdraw when the weight of his sickness became undeniable. Her fiery eyes now avoiding his gaze, her words growing shorter, colder, until even her touch, once fierce and demanding, turned hesitant and rare. She, who had once chased him through nights of reckless pleasure, now found excuses to stay away, claiming business, obligations, or sudden journeys, while in truth the sight of his failing body and hollow laughter made her restless, uneasy, even afraid. Where once she had boasted of possessing him, now she spoke of distance, whispering to friends that she could not risk being tied to his ruin. Sukomi, though prideful, felt the sting sharper than any rumor, for Feyer's absence carved a deeper loneliness than rejection from strangers, leaving him to face the cold truth that even those who swore loyalty could vanish when darkness grew too heavy. It was his cousin, the one who had always watched quietly from the sidelines, who finally could no longer hold back, confronting Sukomi late one evening with a mix of anger and heartbreak, demanding to know why he continued to deny the truth, why he allowed pride to drag him deeper into ruin while family suffered watching him waste away. His cousin's voice shook as he described the whispers in the village, the shame that spread through their household, the sight of mothers pulling children aside whenever Sukomi passed, and he begged him, almost pleaded, to seek help before it was too late. But Sukomi, though shaken by the raw emotion, forced a mocking laugh, lashing back with cruel words about minding one's own business, accusing his cousin of envy and weakness. Yet behind the mask of arrogance, his heart trembled, for deep within he knew the words carried truth. And as the cousin stormed away in frustration, Sukomi stood in silence, feeling more alone than ever before. Day by day, Sukomi's world shrank into a suffocating silence. As friends who once filled his evenings with laughter now crossed the street to avoid him, neighbors closed their doors when he passed, and even casual acquaintances who once greeted him warmly with a nod or handshake found sudden reasons to look the other way. The places where he had been celebrated turned into empty, hostile spaces, and his once magnetic presence became an invisible boundary that no one dared to cross. Nights that were once alive with music and revelry now stretched endlessly, filled only with the echo of his own thoughts and the steady ache of rejection, while the marketplace, the tavern, and the fields became cruel reminders of his fading influence. Each step felt heavier, each glance harsher, and though Sukomi forced himself to pretend he still carried pride, inside he withered, consumed by the bitter loneliness of a man no one wanted to claim anymore. The final blow to Sukomi's fragile pride came when he was summoned before the management and handed the letter that stripped him of his position. The very job that had once defined his identity and given him a sense of importance, now gone with a few coldly written lines. There were no cheers, no protests, only silence as colleagues looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes, some out of pity, others out of relief that his downfall would no longer burden the workplace. His boss spoke briefly, saying it was a decision made after too many chances, after too many ignored warnings, and that though they wished him well, the company could not risk further collapse. Sukomi stood frozen, his hands trembling as the paper crumpled in his grip, his ears buzzing with the weight of humiliation, knowing this was not just the loss of income but the erasure of respect, leaving him adrift, a once proud man stripped of dignity in the very halls where he once shined. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted when Sukomi's cousin, weary of his stubbornness and reckless pride, confronted him again, this time with less pleading and more fury, accusing him of dragging the family's name through filth, of ignoring every chance to redeem himself, of wasting the last bits of strength he had left on denial. Sukomi, frail yet defensive, spat back venomous words, calling his cousin ungrateful, meddlesome, and jealous of the life he once lived, his voice trembling with both anger and exhaustion. The room vibrated with their shouts, neighbors pausing outside to listen, while Sukomi's body shook with coughing fits that cut through his protests, but still he refused to yield. His cousin, eyes wet with rage and sorrow, finally declared he would no longer stand by to watch him destroy himself, storming out with a door slam that echoed like a final judgment, leaving Sukomi trembling in silence, haunted by the weight of truth he dared not admit. Sukomi's once energetic body began to crumble under the weight of illness, the sparkle in his eyes replaced by a dull, yellowish glaze, his skin stretched tight across sharp bones, and his steps reduced to staggering shuffles that drained him after only a few paces. Nights were restless, filled with violent coughing that left bloodstains on the cloth he tried to hide, while fevers came in waves that soaked his bedding with sweat and left him gasping for air. The clothes he once wore with pride now hung loosely, his frame withering to a shadow of the man who had danced boldly through Mama Cootie's parlor. His neighbors, though distant, whispered of his visible decline, and children who once admired his swagger now stared with fear at the hollow cheeks and trembling hands. Meals lost all taste, water felt heavy to swallow, and even the sun seemed too bright for his weakened eyes, as if the world itself had turned against him, dragging him mercilessly toward a fate he still refused to name. As the days dragged on, Sukomi sank deeper into a pit of loneliness that no visitor, no distraction, and no fading memory could lift him from, for his once busy world was now reduced to long hours of silence broken only by the sound of his own labored breathing. The laughter that used to follow him wherever he went had disappeared, replaced by the echo of mocking voices in his head, reminding him of what he had lost and who he had become. At night, he lay staring into the shadows, tormented by regret, replaying every careless choice, every ignored warning, every moment when pride pushed him to turn away from those who loved him. And now there was no one left to call his name with warmth. Depression wrapped around him like a heavy cloak, draining his will to rise, to eat, to fight, leaving him a prisoner in his own body, a man surrounded not by friends or family, but by silence and the crushing weight of emptiness. Desperate for a taste of the old life, Sukomi dragged his frail body back to Mama Cootie's beer parlor, a place that had once erupted with cheers at his arrival, but this time the laughter died down as soon as he entered, the crowd turning to stare with a mix of pity and disgust. His trembling hands reached for a seat, yet the bench that once welcomed him was quickly abandoned, friends shifting away as though his presence carried a curse, their eyes avoiding his as whispers spread across the room. Mama Cootie herself, who had once served him proudly, now hesitated before stepping forward, her voice sharp but laced with sorrow as she told him he could not stay, that his sickness made the customers uneasy, and that he was no longer the man they remembered. Humiliated, Sukomi tried to protest, but the weight of shame silenced him, and with each shaky step back toward the door, the rejection carved deeper into his heart. Alone in the quiet of his dimly lit room, Sukomi sat with his head pressed into his trembling hands, his body weakened but his mind flooded with memories, and as the silence deepened, images of his past rose up one after another. Nights of laughter at the beer parlor, moments of pride as friends admired his swagger, the warmth of Fayer's smile, and the countless warnings he had arrogantly brushed aside. All of it played before him like a cruel theater of regrets. He thought of his cousin's angry words, of the disappointment in his boss's eyes, and of the neighbors who once celebrated his presence but now crossed the street to avoid him. Every choice, every boast, every careless indulgence had led him here, to a bed of sorrow and shame, and though he longed for a chance to undo it all, to be given even one moment of redemption, he knew the past was unchangeable, and that its lessons now weighed heavier than his failing body. Each night, as darkness swallowed the small room, Sukomi lay awake on his thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling while memories stormed through his weary mind, offering no rest. The laughter of friends, the sweet voices of women he once pursued, and the glow of admiration that had followed his every move now returned only as sharp echoes of pain, reminding him of how fleeting and hollow those triumphs were. He turned from side to side, sweat soaking his clothes, his heart pounding with a heaviness that no prayer or distraction could ease, as regret gripped him tighter with every breath. He thought of the chances he had squandered, the warnings he had ignored, the cousin he had dismissed, and the woman he had failed to hold on to, each regret stacking like stones on his chest until he could barely breathe. And in those endless hours of silence, when the world outside slept peacefully, Sukomi battled against his past, chained by mistakes that would not let him go. The hospital became a second home for Sukomi, though not by choice, as each visit reminded him of how fragile his body had become. The white walls smelled of disinfectant, the metal benches were cold against his skin, and the endless waiting left him staring at tired faces of other patients who mirrored his own despair. Nurses walked briskly past, their voices clipped and businesslike, while doctors studied his reports with frowns that deepened with every test. Needles pricked his veins, machines beeped beside his bed, and he felt reduced to numbers on a chart rather than the vibrant man he once was. Friends who once cheered his swagger never showed up here, leaving him to sit alone in long corridors, his cousin the only one patient enough to escort him. Each diagnosis, though wrapped in careful words, carried the same weight of inevitability, pressing down on his spirit as he wondered how long his visits would stretch before they became his permanent stay. The doctor's voice carried a weight that pressed down on Sukomi's chest as he sat across from the polished desk, hands trembling on his knees, while the older man, his glasses perched low, leaned forward with a tone that mixed authority and pity, explaining that the illness had progressed far beyond what medicine could easily repair, that his body was weakening at a pace no treatment could fully stop, and that every reckless choice he had once laughed through was now demanding its price. Sukomi's heart pounded as the words settled, each one like a hammer striking the fragile hope he had clung to, and though the doctor softened his voice, urging him to rest, avoid stress, and prepare for difficult days ahead, the message was clear. Time was slipping, chances were shrinking, and unless Sukomi embraced reality instead of denial, the road ahead would only grow darker, lonelier, and unbearably short. Back at home, Sukomi sat slumped against the wall, his eyes swollen from silent tears, when his cousin quietly entered, carrying no judgment, only the gentle weight of shared pain, and lowered himself beside him. Without rushing, he placed a steady hand on Sukomi's shoulder, speaking in a voice that was both firm and soft, reminding him that though mistakes could not be erased, life was not yet over, and family would not abandon him. Sukomi shook his head, whispering that he was finished, that no one cared, but his cousin countered with patient words, assuring him that love was not measured by perfection, but by endurance in hardship. He recalled their childhood, the dreams they once held, and promised that even if the world turned its back, he would remain, encouraging Sukomi to hold on, to fight with whatever strength was left, because giving up would mean letting regret win entirely. The night was unusually quiet, the hum of distant crickets faint outside the window, as Sukomi lay weakly on his bed, his breathing shallow and uneven, each rise and fall of his chest a struggle against the weight of failing strength. The once proud sparkle in his eyes had dulled into a dim reflection of pain, yet somewhere beneath the exhaustion flickered a trace of surrender. Not to despair but to inevitability. His cousin remained beside him, holding his frail hand with unyielding patience, whispering reassurances that he was not alone, that love remained even as the body faltered. Sukomi's lips trembled as if to form words, but only a faint sigh escaped, carrying with it the unspoken sorrow of lost choices and missed chances, a life once reckless now quieting into stillness. The final breath slipped away gently, like a candle's flame bowing to the wind, leaving silence heavy with grief and a reminder of how quickly glory fades. When the news of Sukomi's passing spread through the community, it moved like a shadow across every corner of the compound, silencing the laughter that once echoed where he boasted proudly of conquests and victories. For now neighbors stood in small circles whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others recalling his charm and wasted potential, while mothers pulled their children closer, warning them quietly not to follow the same careless path. The men who once cheered his daring feats lowered their eyes in shame, unable to deny how quickly false pride could dissolve into tragedy, and the women who had once been part of his reckless escapades wept softly, realizing too late the danger of fleeting pleasures. In hushed voices, elders spoke of his life as both a warning and a lesson, that strength without wisdom collapses, that choices echo far beyond youthful days, and that every decision carves a path which, once chosen, cannot easily be undone.